In June 2025, quietly and without fanfare, Canada activated 7 trade laws, none of them announced at a press conference, none of them labeled retaliation. Yet within 6 months, over $12 billion in U.S. economic losses had accumulated. Minnesota's electric bills surged. Iowa's soybeans were rejected. Florida's cruise ports emptied. It wasn't a headline. It was a slow bleed. The laws targeted residual pesticides, digital revenues, hormone standards, and clean energy exports. They didn't shout. They didn't warn. They simply acted. In Washington, Trump raged. In Ottawa, Carney said nothing. But in the border towns and export-dependent counties of America, the silence screamed. So the question is, when your closest ally strikes without a word, is it still diplomacy or something far more dangerous? For decades, the U.S.-Canada economic relationship was hailed as one of the most stable and mutually beneficial alliances in the world. Over $2 billion in goods crossed the border each day. Canada was not just America's closest neighbor. It was its largest customer. From auto parts in Michigan to grain from Saskatchewan, and from Alberta's energy exports to New York's tourism sector, the two economies were deeply intertwined. In trade, energy, manufacturing, and digital services, the partnership was built on predictability and trust. NAFTA, and later USMCA, provided the legal backbone. Politically, disputes were rare and often resolved quietly. Economically, both countries flourished, riding waves of globalization with a shared belief in open markets and cross-border integration. But cracks began to form in the late 2010s. Trump's first term saw steel and aluminum tariffs that blindsided Canadian producers. The rhetoric shifted from partnership to protectionism. Canada, long seen as a passive ally, began quietly preparing alternatives, diversifying trade to Europe and Asia, and investing heavily in internal market reform. By 2023, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ottawa launched the One Canadian Economy policy, designed to reduce dependency on U.S. markets by streamlining internal trade between provinces. Meanwhile, Washington's unpredictable tariff strategy continued to alienate allies. Then came the second Trump term, and with it, a wave of aggressive trade maneuvers targeting both friends and foes. Canada responded not with press conferences, but with policy. 7 trade laws, each narrowly tailored, technically legal, and highly impactful, were passed without fanfare. They were not aimed at headlines. They were aimed at leverage. And by mid-2025, as states from Texas to Michigan began feeling the sting of canceled contracts and blocked exports, the depth of Canada's silent retaliation became clear. The age of quiet cooperation was over. A new chapter, one of strategic confrontation, had begun. America's gamble. The second Trump administration entered office in January 2025 with a singular message on trade: America first again. And this time, the gloves came off. By February, Trump's trade representative announced a sweeping review of all existing trade agreements, starting with USMCA. The review focused on unfair concessions granted to Canada in agriculture, digital trade, and energy. Within weeks, new tariffs were imposed: 10% on softwood lumber, 15% on aluminum, and a stunning 25% tariff on all digital services revenue originating from Canada, but operating through U.S. platforms. Behind closed doors, Trump advisors reportedly believed Canada would fold fast. After all, in their view, Canada depended far more on U.S. markets than the reverse. They bet that Ottawa would quietly renegotiate. But this wasn't 2017, and Mark Carney wasn't Justin Trudeau. In March, Trump escalated. An executive order suspended cross-border clean energy tax credits, targeting Canadian hydroelectric exports. Simultaneously, new inspection protocols were introduced for agricultural imports from Canada, causing delays of up to 2 weeks at key border crossings. These weren't isolated moves. They were part of a coordinated strategy to bully Canada into a revised trade framework, one more favorable to U.S. agribusiness and oil interests, especially in battleground states like Iowa and Texas. The administration publicly framed it as balancing the scales. In reality, it was a political weapon. State officials from agricultural regions initially applauded. Iowa pork producers saw it as leverage to reduce Canadian inspection hurdles. Energy lobbyists in Texas pushed for greater export quotas. MAGA-aligned governors hailed the tariffs as a revival of national pride. But Wall Street flinched. U.S. businesses operating in Canada, particularly in tech and financial services, warned of backlash. Meanwhile, tourism and manufacturing sectors in border states voiced growing concern about retaliatory disruptions. Trump's team dismissed the warnings. Peter Navarro, newly returned as an economic advisor, called Canada's economy fragile and non-confrontational. Their gamble, Canada wouldn't dare respond forcefully. They were wrong. Canada strikes back quietly. Canada did not respond with fiery speeches or emergency summits. Instead, it weaponized silence and the law. Beginning in April 2025, 7 new trade rules were implemented, all without press fanfare. They targeted specific U.S. vulnerabilities, especially in states that had politically backed Trump's policies. The first rule quietly reclassified pesticide residue levels for imported fruits and vegetables, citing consumer health modernization. Overnight, shipments of Iowa corn and Texas grapefruit were turned away at Canadian borders. The second law suspended electricity export licenses to jurisdictions deemed non-cooperative, a thinly veiled reference to Minnesota, where hydroelectric imports from Manitoba supplied 20% of peak hour demand. That energy gap now had to be filled by local coal and gas at a premium. Within a month, Minnesota residents saw electricity bills spike by 18%. Next came a new sanitary inspection regime targeting U.S. meat. Over 300 tons of pork from Iowa and Missouri were seized, citing hormone violations under Canada's revised Food Safety Act. Meanwhile, digital services tax laws were fast-tracked, applying new levies to streaming platforms, e-commerce, and data centers based in the U.S. but operating Canadian customer bases. In Texas, Canada halted LNG contracts altogether. Ottawa cited environmental compliance audits, but insiders knew it was strategic. Refineries scaled back, jobs were cut, exports halted, tourism wasn't spared. Canadian citizens, once the backbone of seasonal visits to Florida, New York, and Michigan, now faced tighter travel advisories and reduced air routes. Tourism from Canada dropped as much as 42% in Florida alone. Hotel chains reported mass cancellations. The rules weren't called retaliation, but they were. Politically, the genius of Carney's approach was in its precision. Each law impacted U.S. regions that had benefited most from Trump's policies. Yet each measure fell within WTO or USMCA frameworks, making them legally defensible. There were no press conferences, no dramatic gestures, just quiet execution, and it worked. Within 3 months, American business coalitions, from Michigan's auto industry to Florida's cruise lobby, began petitioning Washington to de-escalate. But in public, the Trump administration doubled down. Canada needs us more than we need them, Trump tweeted in June. They'll come around. Privately, governors and congressional leaders from affected states were in panic mode because Canada wasn't coming around. Deadlock at the border. By July 2025, what began as a calculated trade provocation had snowballed into a continental standoff. On one side, the U.S. administration was politically unwilling to admit miscalculation. Trump's base, especially in manufacturing and energy states, had been promised a trade win. Backing down to Canada, of all nations, would appear weak. On the other side, Canada's retaliatory strategy was already in motion. Reversing course now would signal vulnerability. With domestic support high, especially from provinces like Ontario and British Columbia, Carney had no incentive to retreat. In fact, calls grew louder in Parliament to expand the list of retaliatory measures if U.S. tariffs persisted. Caught in the middle were millions of workers and thousands of businesses. In Iowa, ethanol producers face shuttered plants and soaring production costs. In New York, fintech startups lost Canadian contracts due to data transfer restrictions. In Windsor, Ontario, U.S. auto part orders dried up. In Alberta, farm equipment shipments halted due to reciprocal inspections. Each day of deadlock meant more economic pain, but neither side blinked. The international press began taking notice. Le Monde labeled it the quietest trade war. Bloomberg warned of cold NAFTA 2.0. But official diplomacy remained frozen. U.S. governors, including those from swing states, sent a joint letter to the White House in late July urging compromise. Business groups lobbied for a ceasefire, but Trump, cornered politically, refused to lift tariffs without a Canadian concession. Carney refused to offer one. Thus, the world's largest bilateral trade relationship now stood on a knife's edge, fractured not by missiles or manifestos, but by laws and silence. There was no summit planned, no mediator assigned, just two neighbors, each wounded, each proud, waiting for the other to yield. And so, North America waited, uncertain and exposed. The cost to Canada, collateral damage within. In the quiet town of Leamington, Ontario, once known as the tomato capital of Canada, things took a sharp turn. For decades, greenhouse farms here exported fresh produce south of the border, mostly to Michigan and Ohio. But after the enforcement of retaliatory pesticide rules and tighter U.S. inspection regimes in early 2025, shipments began piling up at the border. Some loads sat unrefrigerated for 72 hours, rejected over trace elements previously considered acceptable under USMCA. Suddenly, farmers who once had stable contracts saw them canceled overnight. "We followed every protocol, still got turned back," said Julia Ng, co-owner of a second-generation cucumber farm. Her $1.3 million deal with a Detroit distributor evaporated within a week. It wasn't just produce. Across Canada, small and medium enterprises started to feel the heat. Quebec's maple syrup cooperatives faced new export caps. BC's lumber mills, already reeling from pre-existing softwood duties, lost critical U.S. buyers. Alberta's cattle ranchers, despite internal demand, struggled as U.S. customers retreated under new sanitary protocols. The government moved swiftly. Emergency subsidies were issued. Domestic consumption campaigns launched, but cracks formed. Export-dependent provinces like Nova Scotia and Manitoba reported job losses in shipping and packaging. In Vancouver, port activity dipped 18% from March to June. And yet, for all the pain, there was a shift, resilience. Prime Minister Carney's administration fast-tracked trade missions to Vietnam, Japan, and the EU. One Canadian economy reforms allowed smoother interprovincial commerce, helping reroute supply chains domestically. Still, adaptation couldn't mask the cost. Economists estimate over 40,000 Canadian jobs are at medium to high risk if the standoff continues another 6 months. Businesses are calling for predictability, not just nationalism, because even a quiet war leaves scars. The cost to America, the pain. Trump won't tweet. In Rochester, Minnesota, the Olmsted County Hospital was the first to notice something strange. Their electricity bill, typically predictable, had surged 22% in just 2 months. The culprit? Manitoba Hydro. After Canada's silent enforcement of energy license restrictions, hydroelectric power flowing into Minnesota became limited and erratic. The state was forced to pivot to more expensive local power sources, mostly natural gas. It wasn't just hospitals. Schools, data centers, nursing homes all saw a spike, but the pain ran deeper. In Des Moines, Iowa, the Anderson family pork farm, one of the largest in the state, suffered a devastating blow when 17% of their Canadian contracts were canceled. Canadian inspectors had cited new hormone compliance rules. To them, it felt targeted. To Canada, it was policy. Either way, nearly 45 workers were laid off within weeks. Tourism was no exception. In Miami, Florida, hotel chain bookings dropped 38% year over year. largely due to plummeting Canadian visitors. "It's not just beachgoers. Snowbirds are staying home," said Lucinda Clark, a hospitality manager in South Beach. "And it's not about weather, it's about wallets." U.S. companies started pulling back. Walmart's Canadian division reported inventory disruptions. Tyson Foods halted expansion plans in Quebec. General Motors began revising production forecasts due to supply chain friction in Ontario. Even Silicon Valley felt it. A fintech firm in New York lost its biggest Canadian client due to new digital tax complications. They filed for bankruptcy protection in July. By mid-2025, Brookings estimated nearly 4.8 million U.S. jobs were either exposed or directly at risk due to Canada's layered trade response. But few headlines captured it. Trump's messaging remained defiant. "We're winning," he posted in all caps. Meanwhile, on the ground, grocers in Michigan raised prices. Contractors in Buffalo couldn't get Canadian parts. Students in North Dakota saw tuition hikes after state funding was cut to offset power costs. The cost of a quiet trade war, louder than anyone expected. What began as a shadow conflict now looms as a full-scale regional standoff. Neither Canada nor the United States can claim clean hands nor clean exits. Washington's tariffs have cornered allies into silence. Ottawa's retaliation has turned that silence into a weapon. Millions of jobs hang in the balance. Supply chains, once seamless, now snag on every regulation. And while leaders trade platitudes, farmers, engineers, hotel clerks, and factory workers bear the brunt on both sides of the border. Trump's bravado meets Carney's calculation in a deadlock with no easy way out. Diplomacy grows colder by the day, yet the economies remain as intertwined as ever. So the question becomes clear. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or lose everything trying to go it alone? You are American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.